They called the boy evil and locked him in a room with chains, but his grandmother saw a reflection in a photo. No one noticed, and she ran desperately. What she discovered in the corner of the image changed everyone's life forever. What if the one you call rebellious is actually just silently begging for love? The grandmother didn't need proof. She needed courage. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. What city or country do you call home? Your support helps us bring more powerful, emotional stories to life. Thank you for being here with us. Now, let's begin our story. His fingers trembled as he traced the cold metal bars on his bedroom window, his breath fogging the glass. 9-year-old Ethan hadn't spoken in days. Outside, laughter echoed faintly, unreachable. Inside, silence screamed. Something was terribly wrong, and only one person, miles away, could feel it deep in her bones. Helen sat on her small porch in a quiet, rural American town, watching the afternoon sky shift from bright blue to soft gold. She'd spent the morning tending her rose bushes, a hobby that brought her peace after losing her husband several years prior. At 68, she felt life had slowed down just enough for her to savor each moment, yet a certain restlessness lingered in her heart. Recently, she had tried calling her son Jonas, who lived in a neighboring state. She missed talking to her 9-year-old grandson, Ethan, but her calls often went unanswered. That very afternoon, Helen's phone pinged with a message from a cousin. Attached to it was a seemingly ordinary photograph. At first glance, it looked like a shot of a family gathering, someone else's birthday, or perhaps a casual Sunday get-together. But in the background, near a mirror's edge, Helen noticed something unsettling. A faint reflection of a small figure with dark bruises on his arm. The figure was Ethan. Her heart began to pound. She stared closely at the image, zooming in until she could see the shape of the bruise more clearly. It looked like 5 distinct fingertip marks, as though someone had grabbed his arm. Helen couldn't believe her eyes. She tapped the screen repeatedly, hoping it was just a smudge or a trick of the light. It wasn't. Almost trembling, she dialed Jonas's number. Once again, he didn't pick up. "God help me," she whispered, pressing the phone against her chest. "Ethan, sweetheart, what's happening to you?" Her mind whirled with questions. She knew Jonas could be strict, and his wife Livia was often timid, but physical harm. Helen glanced around her living room, cluttered with family photos that once spoke of happier times. She grabbed an old picture of Ethan from the shelf, taken when he was only 4. He had bright, laughing eyes. That boy was now 9, old enough to express himself, yet she hadn't truly heard his voice in weeks. Something was wrong. Helen opened her text messages and typed a quick note to Jonas. "I saw the picture. Please call me." She spent the rest of the evening pacing restlessly, checking her phone for any sign of response. None came. In the silence of her small house, she felt an overpowering wave of worry. Every second that passed only confirmed that she needed to do something. She couldn't rest while her grandson might be in danger. At sunset, she forced herself to sit by the kitchen window, sipping chamomile tea to steady her nerves. She tried reasoning through the possibilities. Maybe Ethan had hurt himself playing, or perhaps it was nothing sinister. But Helen's gut told her otherwise. She thought about how Jonas had stopped sharing details of Ethan's life, how phone calls with him had become short, distant affairs. She recalled the anxious tone in Livia's voice the last time they'd spoken, almost a year ago, before Jonas abruptly ended the call. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. She fumbled to grab it, only to find a message from the same cousin. "Sorry, sent that picture by mistake. Didn't realize Ethan was in the reflection. Are you okay?" Helen's hands shook as she typed a short reply. "I'm worried. Don't tell anyone we spoke." She knew she had to see Ethan in person. Getting on a bus to Jonas's town was the next logical step, though it filled her with dread. Her arthritic joints made travel hard, and the winter cold was setting in. But none of that mattered compared to the possibility her grandson was in trouble. She imagined the bruise on his arm once more, and the tea nearly slipped from her grasp. Helen had always considered herself a woman of faith, but in that moment she felt a surge of resolve deeper than any prayer she'd ever spoken. She placed her mug in the sink and walked to her bedroom. With careful deliberation, she pulled out a small suitcase from under the bed. If Jonas refused to pick up, she would show up at his door unannounced. She had no guarantee of being welcomed, but she had to at least look Ethan in the eye, see for herself if he was safe. She laid out a few sweaters and a warm coat, glancing at a framed photo of Ethan from last Christmas, the last time she'd seen him in person. He'd been smiling, though Jonas and Livia had seemed tense. Something about that holiday gathering felt off, but at the time, Helen didn't push. Now she wished she had. Before turning in for the night, she sent one more text to Jonas. "I'm coming. I need to see Ethan." Then she tucked her phone under her pillow, praying for a response that never arrived. As the stars blinked across the dark sky, Helen shut her eyes, determined to do whatever it took to protect her grandson. Little did she know that the bruise on Ethan's arm was only one piece of a much larger puzzle, one that would unravel secrets, test her faith, and redefine what it meant to be a family. Helen woke before dawn, the sky still a deep shade of blue. She couldn't recall a time she felt so compelled to act. Usually, her morning routine involved a slow rise, a stretch for her aching back, and a cup of coffee while listening to the birds. Today, every muscle in her body felt tense as she hurried to get dressed. She pulled on a cardigan, checked her wallet, and reviewed her bus schedule. The plan was straightforward. Travel to Jonas's town, show up at his house, demand to see Ethan. She locked her front door, made sure her rose bushes would be watered by her neighbor, and headed to the bus stop 2 blocks away. The crisp morning air made her breath visible. When the bus arrived, she climbed aboard, heart pounding in her chest. Most of the passengers were younger people, probably commuting to work in the city. Helen sat by the window, gripping her purse with white knuckles, trying to calm the storm inside her. She caught her reflection in the glass. Her grey hair braided neatly, wrinkles lining her eyes from years of both smiling and worrying. This was a face that belonged somewhere safe, with a warm blanket and a good book. Instead, she was about to step into a confrontation that frightened her more than she cared to admit. "Mom," a gentle voice said. Helen looked up to see a young woman across the aisle. "Are you okay? You look worried." Helen forced a small smile. "I'm all right, dear. Just a little anxious about seeing my grandson." The woman nodded sympathetically and returned to her phone. Helen turned back to the window, letting the drone of the engine and the passing scenery distract her. And towns flickered by, gas stations, diners, endless farmland, then industrial outskirts. She dozed off for a short while and dreamt of Ethan at 5 years old, running across a meadow near her home, giggling as she pretended to chase him. The memory felt bittersweet now, layered with a sense of urgency. After a few hours, the bus pulled into the station. Helen gathered her bags and stepped onto the concrete platform, a swirl of cold wind hitting her face. She called Jonas again. Still no answer. She decided to take a taxi to his neighborhood, located in a more upscale part of town. During the ride, she noticed wide streets lined with identical houses, each with manicured lawns and 2-car garages. It was painfully neat and quiet, almost sterile. Arriving at Jonas's address, she paid the driver and hesitated at the curb. The house looked well-maintained, grey shutters, neatly trimmed hedges. But as she walked up the driveway, she felt an eerie stillness, like stepping into a scene where everyone pretended all was fine when in truth, it wasn't. Before she could knock, the door swung open. Jonas stood there, eyes narrowed. "Mom? What are you doing here unannounced?" Helen's heart lurched at his cold tone. "I tried to call you. I need to see Ethan." Jonas stepped out and closed the door behind him, forcing her to remain on the porch. "He's not feeling well. He's resting." "I didn't invite you here, and I'm busy with work, so maybe another time." She stared at him, trying not to let her anger spill out. "Jonas, I've come all this way. Something's not right. I saw a bruise on his arm in a photo. I demand to see him now." Jonas folded his arms, jaw tightening. "You have no right to barge into my life accusing me. We raise Ethan how we see fit. You're overstepping." Helen caught a glimpse of movement behind the window's curtain. Perhaps it was Ethan or Livia. "Son," she said softly, "I'm not here to fight. But if Ethan needs help, I won't turn a blind eye." He grunted dismissively. "You think you know everything, just because you raised me alone after Dad died. Times have changed, Mum. You spoil Ethan with your softness. He's got behavioral issues. He can be violent. Those bruises could have been from him throwing a tantrum." Helen's lips quivered. "I've known that boy since birth. He's no brute. If there's a problem, let me talk to him." Jonas ignored her plea. "Please go. I'll call you later." Then, without waiting for a response, he stepped back inside and shut the door. Helen stood there, stunned and furious, the cold wind biting her cheeks. She knocked again, but no one answered. Eventually, she gave up and retreated to the sidewalk. Every fiber in her being told her that Ethan was somewhere inside, scared and alone. But Jonas's hostility was palpable, blocking her at every turn. She spent the next hour wandering the neighborhood in a daze, trying to figure out her next move. A neighbor walked a dog across the street and eyed Helen curiously. She considered approaching them, but was uncertain if they'd help or if they were friendly with Jonas. Desperate for a place to think, Helen found a nearby cafe. She ordered a coffee and sank into a corner booth. The warmth of the mug soothed her trembling hands, but did nothing for the heaviness in her heart. She needed a plan. She thought about calling Child Protective Services, but the idea terrified her. Would that push Jonas to hide Ethan even more? As she gazed out the cafe window, she noticed a figure at the intersection. A slight woman with dark hair clutching a shopping bag. It was Livia. Acting on impulse, Helen hurried outside, calling her name. Livia froze, looking petrified. "Helen!" she said, glancing around as if expecting Jonas to appear any second. "Please," Helen whispered, stepping closer, "tell me what's going on." Livia's eyes welled with tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but then bit her lip. "I can't. Jonas wouldn't like it." Helen placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I only want to help Ethan. If you're in trouble, I can help you too." Livia seemed torn, shifting nervously. Then, before she could reply, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and turned pale. "I'm sorry," she muttered, pulling away. "I have to go." She hurried off in the opposite direction, leaving Helen more worried than ever. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Helen realized she was in for a battle far more complicated than she had imagined. She caught sight of a nearby motel sign. Determined not to leave without answers, she decided to stay overnight. Little did she know that a single day had barely scratched the surface of secrets hidden behind Jonas's door, and the bruise on Ethan's arm was just the beginning of a deep, painful revelation waiting to unfold. The next morning, Helen woke in the modest motel room, a swirl of uneasy dreams lingering in her mind. She quickly got dressed, thinking of ways to see Ethan. As she checked her phone, she noticed a text from Jonas. "Stop meddling. We're fine. Leave town." Her stomach churned at the bluntness of his words, but it also fueled her resolve. She decided to try another approach. If Jonas refused to let her inside the house, maybe someone at Ethan's school would talk to her. She remembered that Ethan had mentioned a kind principal once, but she couldn't recall a name. A quick internet search led her to the local elementary school phone number. Within minutes, she was on the line with a secretary who told her to come by midday. The school building, a spacious brick structure surrounded by a neatly kept lawn, looked welcoming. Helen could almost imagine Ethan running across the playground. She introduced herself at the front office, and the secretary escorted her to a quiet office labeled Principal Camille Thompson. Inside, a slender woman with auburn hair and glasses greeted Helen with a firm handshake. "I'm Ms. Thompson, but please call me Camille. I understand you're Ethan's grandmother?" Helen nodded. "Yes. Thank you for meeting me. I'm concerned about Ethan's well-being, but I'm getting shut out by my son. I don't know how else to reach Ethan." Camille pursed her lips and folded her hands on the desk. "Ethan has been absent for over a week. That's unusual even for him. I've tried calling Jonas and Livia, but the responses are vague. Something feels off." Helen felt a wave of relief that she wasn't alone in her suspicions. "Exactly. I saw bruises on my grandson's arm in a photograph. Jonas insists it's nothing, but my gut tells me there's more to it." Camille stood, moving to a file cabinet. "I probably shouldn't be showing you this without formal procedures, but I've kept some of Ethan's artwork from last month. He's a quiet boy, but his drawings spoke volumes." She handed Helen a folder. Inside were pages of childlike sketches. The first was a figure locked in what looked like a small room with bars. Another showed two tall, shadowy figures towering over a smaller figure lying on the ground. The final drawing had a single word scrawled in shaky letters: "Help." Helen felt tears burn in her eyes. "Oh, dear God! Why didn't anyone act sooner?" Camille sighed. "We reached out to Jonas. He said Ethan was seeing a therapist. Without clearer evidence, we had limited power to intervene. But your visit suggests things could be worse than we feared." Helen pressed her hand against her mouth, trying to steady her breathing. "I need to see him, Camille. I can't just stand by." Camille seemed to weigh her options. "I have no direct authority to force a home visit, but if you're willing, I can provide documentation of these drawings to Child Protective Services. Maybe that'll give them grounds to investigate." Helen hesitated, recalling the fear in Livia's eyes. Would calling the authorities escalate things dangerously? Yet the images left no room for denial. She nodded. "Yes, please do it." They spent the next hour discussing steps, including how to remain discreet so that Jonas wouldn't simply hide Ethan deeper. By the time Helen left the office, she felt a grim mix of anxiety and hope. She clutched the folder of sketches as if they were precious evidence that might save her grandson. Outside, she paused by a mural near the playground, a vibrant painting of children laughing and playing in the sun. The stark contrast to Ethan's drawings made her chest tighten. She remembered Ethan at around 5, describing how he loved coloring pages of superheroes. Now, his creativity reflected only despair and fear. Her phone buzzed in her purse. She fumbled for it, praying it wasn't another threat from Jonas. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. "Meet me behind the grocery store on Maple Avenue at 6 p.m. L." She reread the message. L. That had to be Livia. For the rest of the afternoon, Helen found herself restlessly pacing her motel room, glancing at the clock every few minutes. She wondered if Livia had something important to reveal. Maybe she was finally ready to speak the truth. The hours dragged, but eventually, the time arrived. Helen took a taxi to Maple Avenue, feeling her heart pound in her ears. She got out near an old grocery store with a flickering neon sign. Daylight was giving way to dusk, painting the sky with purple and orange streaks. She walked around to the back alley, where a single dim lamp buzzed overhead. Footsteps echoed. Livia emerged from the shadows, eyes darting around nervously. "Helen," she whispered, voice trembling. "I'm sorry about running away yesterday. I didn't know what to say." Helen reached out gently. "It's okay, dear. Just tell me about Ethan. Is he safe?" Livia clutched a worn handbag to her chest. "Jonas has become different. He used to be strict, but now he's paranoid. He locks Ethan in his room, says it's for his own good. He claims Ethan has anger issues, that he needs discipline, but I've never seen Ethan lash out violently. He's just quiet, scared." Helen's throat went dry. "This is worse than I imagined." "Is Jonas hurting him?" Livia nodded, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I've seen bruises more than once. If I question him, Jonas accuses me of disloyalty. He says I'm too weak to handle Ethan. I tried to speak up, but Jonas, he threatened me, said he'd claim I'm mentally unstable." Helen squeezed Livia's hand. "You're not alone. The school's principal has proof in Ethan's drawings. We're getting Child Protective Services involved." Livia's eyes went wide. "If Jonas finds out, he'll hide Ethan somewhere else. I'm afraid he'll never let me or anyone see him again." Helen's mind raced. She realized that time was running out. "Is there any way for me to see Ethan face to face?" she asked softly. "Anything that might help me confirm he's okay." Livia hesitated, looking at the ground. "Jonas has a business meeting tomorrow afternoon. That might be our chance. Around 2 o'clock, I can leave the back door unlocked." Helen felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you. We need to act quickly but carefully." A noise on the street startled them, someone dropping a bottle in a distant dumpster. Livia jumped. She leaned closer and whispered, "Don't contact me until tomorrow. I'll try to keep Ethan calm, just be careful." Before Helen could respond, Livia slipped away into the darkness, leaving Helen alone in the alley. She stood there, her heart pounding, a cold wind brushing against her cheek. She realized just how fragile the situation was. One wrong move, and Jonas might vanish with Ethan. Gripping her jacket tight, Helen made her way back to the main road. She looked up at the sky, a silent plea forming on her lips. "Please let me save my grandson." The flickering street lamp illuminated her path, just enough for her to see the next step forward, both literally and metaphorically. The following day arrived like a weight on Helen's shoulders. She woke early in the motel, her stomach twisting with apprehension. At breakfast in the small lobby, she could barely eat the toast and jam she'd served herself. Her mind replayed Livia's terrified expression and the nerve-wracking plan they'd devised. Helen checked her phone. No calls from Jonas and no new messages from Livia. She left the motel around noon, feeling the icy breeze nip at her cheeks. To create a plausible story, she took a short walk around town first, stopping by a local thrift store where she pretended to browse. She needed an alibi in case Jonas asked neighbors about a strange woman hanging around. The minutes ticked by until the clock struck 1:30. Time to make her move. She made her way to Jonas's house, carefully avoiding the main street. The neighborhood was quiet, many adults presumably at work and children still at school. When she reached the tidy 2-story home, she noticed his car missing from the driveway. Good, she thought. Maybe he'd already left for that business meeting. Helen slipped into the narrow walkway on the side of the house, scanning for security cameras or any sign that Jonas was still home. She spotted none. With a trembling hand, she tested the back door. It opened. She exhaled a slow breath, stepping inside to a small laundry room. A quiet hush enveloped the interior, broken only by the hum of the washing machine. "Ethan," she called softly, heart racing. She peeked into the kitchen. No one there. She moved toward the hallway, calling his name again in a near whisper. Then a soft shuffle came from somewhere upstairs. Helen carefully ascended, noticing the plush carpet and the immaculate decor, everything in perfect order, like an image from a magazine. But it felt sterile, devoid of warmth. At the top of the stairs, she encountered a corridor with several doors. One of them, the last on the right, had a bolt on the outside. Her pulse sped up. She approached, reaching for the handle, only to find it locked from the other side. "Ethan, honey, are you in there?" she whispered, leaning her ear to the door. A faint sniffle answered her. She tried jiggling the bolt. It slid free with a light click. She eased the door open. Inside, the curtains were drawn, leaving the room dim. She saw Ethan curled up on the bed, hugging his knees, eyes wide and red from crying. His arms bore several dark bruises. "Grandma?" he croaked, blinking like he couldn't believe she was real. Helen knelt beside him, tears filling her eyes. "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry it took me this long." She reached out gently, and he winced at first, then relaxed into her touch. He whispered, "Dad said I can't leave my room because I'm dangerous. But I'm not. Sometimes I get scared." Helen's heart clenched. "I know you're not dangerous. I saw your drawings. I'm here to help." She gingerly touched one of the bruises on his forearm. He flinched. "Does it hurt a lot?" Ethan nodded. "He gets mad when I try to talk back or ask questions. Mom tries to protect me, but she can't do much." Helen fought back anger. "Oh, Ethan, I'm going to get you out of here." Footsteps echoed downstairs, causing them both to freeze. Helen felt her breath catch in her throat. She hadn't expected anyone to be home. She ushered Ethan to hide in the corner behind the bed, pressing a finger to her lips. A voice drifted up the stairs. "Ethan, you in there?" It sounded like Livia, though laced with tension. Helen felt a surge of relief. She stood up carefully and moved to the doorway. Livia's figure emerged, looking jumpy. The younger woman breathed out when she spotted Helen. "Jonas forgot his briefcase. He'll be back in 30 minutes, Livia whispered urgently. "You have to leave soon before he realizes you're here." Helen pressed her lips together. "I can't just leave him like this." Livia's face twisted with guilt. "I know. But if Jonas finds you, he'll take Ethan away somewhere else. He threatened to move to another state." Ethan clung to Helen's arm. "I want to go with you, Grandma." Helen's mind raced. What was the safest option right now? She wanted to grab Ethan and run. But abducting her own grandson could complicate everything legally, especially if Jonas manipulated evidence against her. Child Protective Services hadn't yet had time to fully intervene. If Jonas realized Helen had come, he would vanish, making rescue even harder. She looked at Livia. "Please come with us. We can find somewhere safe." Tears brimmed in Livia's eyes. "I'm terrified, but I have no money, nowhere to go. Jonas keeps everything under his control." Helen remembered the supportive principal at school and the hospital nurse. "We'll figure it out. There are shelters, resources. Anything is better than this." Ethan's eyes flickered with hope, but Livia's posture was uncertain. She shook her head. "If we leave now, Jonas will hunt us down. Let me distract him for a day or two. I'll tell him you gave up and went back home. Meanwhile, you gather whatever legal help you can. Then we'll leave together." Helen hesitated, torn between immediate escape and a more cautious approach. Ethan gripped her sleeve as if begging her not to go. She gently touched his cheek. "Listen, sweet boy, I promise I will come for you. This is temporary." He nodded bravely, though tears streaked his face. "I trust you." Livia checked the window. "He's here." Panic flared in her eyes. "You need to go, Helen, now." Helen exhaled a shaky breath. She hugged Ethan tightly, whispering in his ear, "I love you and I'm not leaving you behind forever." Then she slipped out of the room and hurried down the stairs, her footsteps surprisingly quiet for someone in her 60s. The laundry room door still stood ajar. She rushed out into the backyard, careful to shut it softly. Rounding the corner of the house, she saw Jonas pulling into the driveway. She crouched behind a row of hedges, heart pounding, until he entered the house. Only then did she escape down the street unseen. She didn't stop walking until she reached a busier intersection. Her emotions came crashing over her in waves, relief at seeing Ethan, sorrow at leaving him behind, and fury at the injustice of it all. She wiped at her cheeks, determined not to succumb to despair. There were allies out there, the principal, the nurse, possibly Child Protective Services. She had to be strategic. Helen now fully grasped the scope of Jonas's control. But she also sensed that he was on the edge, and the slightest push could make him do something drastic. There would be no second chance if they messed this up. Heading back to her motel, she formulated a plan in her mind. She would not rest until Ethan was free, safe, and far from those locked doors and bruises that marred his innocence. One step at a time, she told herself, one step at a time. That same evening, Helen sat in her cramped motel room, surrounded by notes scrawled on bits of paper. She was trying to piece together every resource she had: the contact for Child Protective Services, phone numbers for local domestic abuse hotlines, the sympathetic principal named Camille, and the nurse from the hospital. She needed a unified plan to rescue Ethan and possibly Livia as well. She picked up her phone and placed a call to a local helpline, explaining the basics of the situation. The woman on the other end listened carefully, asking pointed questions about the bruises, the locked room, and Jonas's controlling behavior. Helen's voice shook, but she pressed on. Though the operator gave her general advice, Helen needed more concrete help. She left her contact information, hoping for a quick callback. At 9 o'clock, her phone finally rang. The caller ID was unknown. She answered, heart pounding. "This is Helen." "Hello, Ma'am," said a soft-spoken voice. "My name is Miranda. I'm a nurse at County General Hospital. I believe we spoke indirectly when you came for that checkup. I recognized your name from the files. Camille from the school told me you might reach out." Helen pressed the phone to her ear. "Yes, oh thank goodness. I'm so grateful you called. We need help. For my grandson Ethan. He's in real danger." Miranda's voice steadied. "I've documented some injuries Ethan had when he came to the hospital a few weeks ago. The official report states they were accidental, but I had my suspicions. I wanted to let you know I'm willing to share any medical records that might support your case. The authorities might take that more seriously than just drawings." Helen felt a small wave of relief. Concrete evidence, something Jonas couldn't easily dismiss. "Thank you, Miranda. That's exactly what I need. How can we do this safely? Jonas is unpredictable." Miranda agreed to meet Helen the next day in the hospital cafeteria, where she could hand over copies of Ethan's medical records. They settled on a time in the late morning. After hanging up, Helen felt a glimmer of hope. With enough documentation, she could push Child Protective Services to intervene swiftly, maybe even obtain an emergency custody order. Early the next day, Helen arrived at the hospital. The cafeteria bustled with visitors and staff grabbing coffee or a quick bite. She spotted Miranda at a corner table, a young woman with curly hair pinned back, wearing bright scrubs. She gave Helen a warm smile and slid a small manila envelope across the table as soon as Helen sat down. "X-rays and notes from my personal log," Miranda whispered, leaning in. "I can't outright accuse anyone without an investigation, but these bruises are consistent with strong grips. The narrative that the father gave was that Ethan fell. But look, here and here, the shapes are clearly indicative of fingers." Helen's eyes welled with tears. "You're an angel for risking this." Miranda placed a reassuring hand on hers. "Trust me, we see cases like this too often. But it's tricky when a parent is manipulative and the child is too scared to talk. Having multiple sources, school records, medical reports, and direct witness accounts will strengthen your claim. Helen placed the envelope into her purse gently. Thank you truly. Feeling more confident, Helen headed to the local Child Protective Services office. The building was nondescript, a dull grey facade with glass doors. Inside, the receptionist directed her to a waiting area. After some minutes, a woman named Ms. Barrington introduced herself as a social worker. Helen recounted the entire situation, from the photo bruise to Ethan's locked room and the recent medical records. Ms. Barrington took notes, her expression grim. Given the evidence you're presenting, it's enough for us to consider an emergency intervention, especially if there is imminent risk of harm. Please, he's terrified, Helen pleaded. I'm afraid Jonas might move him out of state if he suspects we're onto him. Ms. Barrington nodded firmly. We'll try to act quickly, but remember, in legal matters, things can be slower than anyone likes. We need to verify addresses, coordinate with the police if necessary, and talk to Ethan. Any sign of immediate danger, and we'll remove him from the home. Helen swallowed hard. She thanked Ms. Barrington and left, her mind swirling with worry about Jonas's next move. Before heading back to the motel, she decided to call Camille, the principal, to update her. Camille, I submitted everything to Child Protective Services, Helen said. They might call you to confirm Ethan's drawings and absences. Understood, Camille replied. I'll make sure they have all the records I kept. By the way, Ethan's official transcript shows sudden personality changes over the last few months. He went from being shy but pleasant to withdrawn and fearful. That might help too. Helen's chest felt heavy with a mix of relief and dread. She realized each passing minute gave Jonas more time to plan a way out. She thought about Livia too. Had she convinced Jonas that Helen left town? If he found out about her actions, the fallout could be devastating. Returning to her motel, she found a small message slipped under her door. Meet me in the side parking lot at the library, 6 p.m. L. Helen's heart raced. Another clandestine meeting with Livia. She wondered if it was safe, but suspected Livia had more information. That evening, the library parking lot was nearly empty, the old brick building looming in the dusk. Helen waited beside a lamppost, arms wrapped around herself to ward off the chill. Minutes later, Livia appeared from between two parked cars, her face pale and anxious. Jonas keeps talking about leaving, Livia blurted as soon as she approached Helen. He mentioned an old friend out of state who could provide a place for treatment for Ethan. He said he's tired of this drama. Helen's heart hammered. We've got Child Protective Services on our side now. They're supposed to act soon. If Jonas tries to flee, it could turn into a kidnapping case. Livia wrung her hands. He's hiding documents. Passports, birth certificates. I saw him rummaging through them. If he has a plan, we have little time. Ethan is so scared. He keeps asking for you. I don't know how long I can keep Jonas calm. Helen gently placed a hand on Livia's shoulder. Listen, I have enough evidence to push for an emergency order. If we can stall Jonas just a bit longer, we can get Ethan out legally. Livia sniffled, tears brimming. I'll do whatever it takes. I'm done being afraid. They spent the next 10 minutes coordinating a strategy. If Jonas attempted to leave suddenly, Livia would call Helen, who would alert Ms. Barrington. They also agreed to keep all communication hidden from Jonas. Livia would stow away a small bag of Ethan's clothes and hide them in the garage, ready for a quick escape if needed. Suddenly, headlights flashed across the parking lot. Livia tensed. I have to go, she whispered. I told Jonas I was just out buying groceries. Helen nodded, her voice trembling. Thank you for your bravery. Hang in there. Livia disappeared into the shadows, leaving Helen alone with her thudding heart. Every new revelation made the danger more real. The question that haunted her was whether Child Protective Services would act in time. Jonas was clearly on the brink. One wrong move, and they might lose Ethan for good. Helen looked up at the library's old stone facade, thinking of all the knowledge and stories contained inside. Yet none of them could truly prepare her for this ordeal. She remembered the envelope from Miranda, the drawings from Camille, and the consistent bruises on Ethan's arms. This was real, pressing, and far too close to becoming tragic. She returned to her motel, phone in hand, half expecting a frantic call that Jonas had disappeared already. But all was quiet. It was unnerving. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing the possible outcomes. She prayed that come morning, Child Protective Services would be ready to make their move, and that Jonas wouldn't sense the approaching storm. Because once he did, she feared he'd take Ethan and vanish without a trace. The next morning arrived with a grey sky and a biting wind that rustled the motel curtains. Helen had barely slept. By 8 o'clock she was already up, glancing at her phone incessantly. Finally, she received a call from Ms. Barrington. "We have a slot in the family court for an emergency hearing this afternoon. You'll need to be there at 2. We've informed Jonas and Livia as well." Helen's stomach flipped. This was it, the beginning of a legal confrontation. She dressed carefully, opting for a modest navy skirt and a warm sweater, trying to calm her nerves. Before heading out, she whispered a small prayer. "Give me strength." The county courthouse stood on a wide street near the city center, a squat brick building that seemed unassuming for such high-stakes matters. Helen entered through the main doors, passing the security checkpoint. She felt out of place among the attorneys and clerks bustling by, but she steadied herself with the thought of Ethan's well-being. A court assistant guided her to a small waiting area outside the courtroom. She recognized Ms. Barrington sitting on a bench, flipping through papers. Next to her was a man in a suit, likely an attorney assigned to the case. Helen was introduced to him briefly, Mr. Gray, a public interest lawyer who specialized in child welfare cases. As they waited, Jonas stormed into the hallway, face dark with anger. Livia followed behind him, head down. The tension was palpable. Jonas shot Helen a glare but said nothing, clenching his jaw so tightly she could see the veins on his neck. Helen wondered if Ethan had been forced to come as well, but he was nowhere in sight. Soon, a bailiff announced that the hearing would begin. Everyone filed into the small courtroom. It was more sterile than dramatic. No towering judge's bench, just a modest raised desk where the judge sat, flanked by the state seal. People found their seats, and Helen ended up behind Jonas and Livia, unable to meet their eyes. Judge Nelson, a middle-aged woman with a thoughtful expression, entered and called the session to order. Ms. Barrington spoke first, detailing the concerns about Ethan's well-being, citing the medical records from Miranda, the school drawings provided by Camille, and the repeated bruises observed by multiple sources. Helen listened, heart pounding at each new piece of evidence. Jonas's attorney, an older man with a stern face, argued that there was insufficient proof of abuse. He waved around a few documents, falsified therapist notes, Helen presumed, claiming Ethan had violent outbursts. "These are not abuse marks, Your Honor," the man insisted. "They are the result of Ethan harming himself during a meltdown." Helen's jaw tightened. She looked to Livia, hoping she might speak up, but Livia's eyes were fixed on the floor. Then Judge Nelson asked if there was anyone with direct observation of Ethan's condition. Helen steadied her breathing and raised her hand. The judge acknowledged her. Clearing her throat, Helen said, "I'm Ethan's grandmother. I visited the house recently, saw my grandson locked in his room with visible bruises." She spoke calmly, explaining her interactions with Jonas. She left out the part where she snuck in, focusing instead on Ethan's emotional state and the locked door. Jonas's attorney swiftly objected, calling her statements hearsay. The judge allowed Helen to continue, but reminded her to stick to what she personally witnessed. Helen's heart pounded as she recalled Ethan's fearful eyes. She ended by emphasizing, Ethan was pleading for help. That's not the behavior of a child just having tantrums. Jonas finally stood to speak, voice dripping with hostility. Your Honor, my mother has always been too soft. She spoils Ethan. He gets frustrated and lashes out. I had to take measures to keep him safe from hurting himself, especially after doctors suggested he might have behavioral issues. That's why he was in a secure room. Helen seethed internally, but she had to remain composed. Jonas was twisting facts skillfully. The judge then turned to Livia. Ma'am, would you like to speak about your son's condition? Livia swallowed, glancing between Jonas, Helen, and the judge. A heavy silence fell. Finally, with trembling hands, she stood. I've seen Ethan get scared, not violent. Yes, he's had emotional struggles, but I never believed locking him up was necessary. Jonas insisted it was the only way. Jonas shot her a venomous glare, but she pressed on. I'm worried about Ethan. I'm worried about my husband's temper, and I'm worried that if we're not careful, we'll lose Ethan forever. Her words made Jonas's face darken. His attorney quickly tried to downplay Livia's testimony as confusion. The judge tapped her pen on the desk, eyes narrowed in thought. Given the conflicting accounts, I'm inclined to arrange a professional evaluation of Ethan outside the parents' home. For that, I need to place him in temporary protective custody. Helen felt a rush of hope at the judge's statement, but Jonas's reaction was explosive. He sprang to his feet, nearly shouting, "This is an outrage. You have no right to take my son." The judge banged her gavel. "Order in the court, Mr. Baker." Another outburst like that, and I'll hold you in contempt. This is about ensuring the child's safety while we investigate further. The hearing lasted another hour, with more back-and-forth arguments. Eventually, the judge mandated that Ethan be temporarily placed with a foster family or a state-approved guardian while further assessments were conducted. Helen wished she could volunteer, but Jonas's attorney objected, painting her as biased. The judge didn't have enough evidence to place Ethan directly under Helen's care yet. Outside the courtroom, Jonas confronted Helen, pointing a finger in her face. "You're tearing this family apart. Mark my words, you'll regret meddling in our affairs." Helen stood her ground, a quiet steel in her gaze. "If it keeps Ethan safe, I don't care what I have to do." Livia hovered behind Jonas, her lips pressed tight. Helen offered her a sympathetic look, which Livia returned with a silent nod, grateful but terrified. Then Jonas stormed away, his footsteps echoing angrily down the hallway. Miss Barrington caught up with Helen, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "This is a good step, even if it's not perfect. A professional will evaluate Ethan, and the court will see the truth. Give it time." Helen nodded, though her heart still ached. Time was both ally and adversary here. She worried about what Jonas might do next, especially if he felt cornered. She saw a flicker of fear in Livia's eyes too, as she hurried after her husband. The day's events had been dramatic, but Helen sensed the real storm was still gathering. The hearing was just the first battle in a war that might get darker before any light broke through. The day after the hearing, Helen stayed in close contact with Miss Barrington. The social worker's updates were cautious. A child services officer had attempted to schedule a meeting with Jonas and Ethan, but Jonas was stonewalling them, claiming Ethan was too unwell. The placement for Ethan's temporary custody remained stalled, and every hour that passed left Helen more anxious. Early that afternoon, Helen's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She answered, bracing herself for the worst. To her surprise, it was Livia, speaking in hurried, hushed tones. "Jonas told me he's taking Ethan out of state tonight," Livia said, voice shaking. "He wants to avoid the authorities. He's packing. Please, you'll have to help us." Helen's heart slammed in her chest. "Where are you now?" "I'm hiding in the bathroom," Livia whispered. "We're supposed to leave in a few hours. I'm scared." If I resist, he'll do something drastic. He keeps ranting that the judge is against him, that you've betrayed him." Helen grabbed her purse. "Stay calm. I'll call Ms. Barrington and the police. Is Ethan okay?" "He's locked in his room again," Livia answered, choking back a sob. "He's crying. Jonas said if I don't comply, he'll take Ethan alone and vanish. I can't let that happen." Helen's mind raced. "Leave the phone on if you can. We'll come. We'll do something. Just hang in there." She ended the call and dialed Ms. Barrington in a panic, explaining the urgent development. Within minutes, Ms. Barrington had the police and child services on high alert. They agreed to meet Helen near Jonas's house. A small convoy of official cars would approach, but they needed probable cause to enter without Jonas's permission, which his defiance had conveniently provided. Helen rushed to the designated intersection, adrenaline surging. When she arrived, a pair of squad cars were there, along with a Child Protective Services vehicle. Ms. Barrington stood by, tense but determined. "We have a court order now," she said, flashing a document. "Jonas's attempt to flee has given us enough to intervene forcibly." Helen nodded, relief mixing with fear. "Let's not waste time." The group moved quickly down Jonas's street. Officers knocked on the door, commanding Jonas to come out. At first, there was only silence. Then, from an upstairs window, Jonas appeared, furious. "Get off my property!" he bellowed. One of the officers called up to him. "Sir, we have a court order demanding Ethan's immediate protective custody. Failure to comply will result in your arrest." Helen stood behind the officers, heart pounding. She worried about Ethan locked in that room and how Jonas might react. Suddenly, the front door swung open. Jonas stood there, face twisted with anger. He blocked the doorway, refusing to let anyone inside. "I know my rights," he spat. "Ethan is my son, and I'm protecting him from all of you meddling fools." Ms. Barrington handed the court order to one of the officers, who tried to show it to Jonas. "Sir, you are legally required to relinquish the child to our custody while the investigation proceeds." Jonas snatched the paper and tore it in half. "That's what I think of your order," he yelled, before attempting to slam the door shut. But the officers forced their way in, threatening to detain him if he resisted further. The confrontation escalated into a shouting match, Jonas cursing at them while they secured the area. Meanwhile, Helen slipped past, searching desperately for Livia and Ethan. She heard frantic voices coming from upstairs, so she climbed, heart in her throat. She found a distraught Livia in the hallway, tears staining her cheeks. "He's in there," Livia sobbed, pointing to Ethan's locked room. "Jonas threatened to take him if I tried to stop him." Helen tried the door. It was locked. An officer behind them produced a small toolkit and quickly jimmied the lock open. The door swung wide, revealing Ethan curled in a corner, hugging a small backpack. He looked up, eyes wide with shock. "Grandma!" he cried, dropping the backpack and rushing into her arms. Helen held him close, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay, darling. You're safe now. You're safe." Officers surveyed the room, taking pictures of the bolt on the outside, the bruises on Ethan's arms, and the general disarray. Outside in the hall, Jonas's voice thundered, furious at the intrusion. Then came the clanking of handcuffs, followed by a sharp order for Jonas to calm down or face additional charges. Livia hovered in the doorway, torn between relief and terror. She saw Ethan sobbing in Helen's embrace. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she whispered, stepping forward to touch his shoulder. He looked up at her, not quite certain whether to trust her. She'd often been forced to stand by while Jonas mistreated him, but now she seemed genuinely contrite. One of the officers entered. "We have to take Ethan into protective custody for now. We'll let the social services handle his placement." Helen felt her stomach clench. She understood this was standard procedure, but she longed to be the one who took Ethan away from this nightmare. "I'm his grandmother," she said softly. I'd like to be considered as a guardian." The officer nodded sympathetically. "That's up to the court and Child Protective Services, but your request will be noted." As they led Ethan downstairs, Jonas was standing in the living room, hands cuffed behind his back. He glared at them all. "This is a witch hunt," he roared, voice echoing off the walls. "You'll pay for this, Helen!" Helen refused to look away. She met his anger with a cold, determined gaze. "You did this to yourself, Jonas. All I want is for Ethan to be safe." Livia stood behind Helen, trembling. She whispered to her mother-in-law, "Thank you for not giving up on us." Helen placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure out the next steps together, but the important thing is that Ethan is free from this." As the officers escorted Jonas outside, neighbors began to gather on the sidewalk. The hush around them felt heavy, broken only by the shuffle of boots and the murmurs of onlookers. Jonas was put into a squad car, still raging. Finally, Child Services guided Ethan to their vehicle. The boy clutched Helen's hand until the very last moment. He looked up at her, tears shining in his eyes. "Will I see you again soon?" Helen swallowed hard. "Yes, sweetheart. I promise. I won't abandon you." Miss Barrington gave Helen a nod. "We'll be in touch about the hearing to determine temporary guardianship. For now, Ethan will be placed somewhere safe." The door to the Child Services car closed, and Helen watched it drive away with a mix of relief and heartbreak. She'd fought so hard to protect him, yet letting him leave without her felt agonizing. Livia watched too, a silent stream of tears coursing down her face. At least now, Ethan was out of that locked room. But Helen couldn't escape the feeling that the fight wasn't over. Jonas might be detained, but legal battles could stretch on for weeks, even months. She felt a deep ache in her chest, thinking of the boy who had once giggled in her garden, now whisked into a system she only hoped would handle him with care. Helen took a step back from the house, feeling the crisp air fill her lungs. She thought of all the times she had let her suspicions slide, trusting Jonas to do the right thing. No more, she told herself. She would stand by Ethan until he was truly safe. The unexpected turn of Jonas's arrest was a victory, but new complications lurked just beyond the horizon, waiting to test her resolve again. Over the next several days, Helen found herself in a whirlwind of legal appointments and phone calls. Jonas was charged with child endangerment, though his lawyer sought to minimize the accusations. Ethan was placed in a temporary foster home, pending the court's decision about custody. Livia gave a statement to the authorities detailing Jonas's abuse, hoping this would accelerate the process and potentially allow her to reunite with her son. One bright morning, Helen was summoned to another hearing, this time with the possibility of Ethan being placed under her care. She arrived early at the courthouse, greeted Ms. Barrington, and settled into a seat in the waiting area. She glanced around at the sterile walls, remembering the tension of the previous hearing. Today, she hoped for a calmer, more decisive outcome. The doors opened, and Helen saw Ethan escorted in by a social worker. Her heart leaped at the sight of her grandson, though he seemed paler and thinner than she remembered. He spotted her, gave a small wave, but did not smile. The weight of everything he'd been through showed in his wary gaze. When the session began, Judge Nelson presided once more. Lawyers on both sides took turns presenting updates. Ms. Barrington shared evidence of Jonas's controlling behavior, reinforcing that Ethan needed a safe environment away from his father. Jonas's attorney argued that Jonas deserved bail and that the accusations were exaggerated. Meanwhile, Livia's stance was complicated. She wanted to be with her son, but the court questioned her capacity to protect Ethan, given her previous inaction. Helen was then invited to the stand, where she testified about her willingness to care for Ethan full-time. The judge eyed her kindly, but also probed her on practical matters. "Miss Baker, you're retired, correct? Do you have the financial resources and the physical ability to care for a child of Ethan's age? Helen steadied her voice. Yes, Your Honor, I'm retired. I receive a pension and I have some savings. My home is modest, but I can provide a stable environment. I'm in reasonable health, though I do have some arthritis. Still, I can manage daily tasks and ensure Ethan goes to school, has proper meals, and gets counseling if needed. Judge Nelson nodded, taking notes. The arguments continued for another hour, then the judge requested a recess. Helen, Ethan, and the social workers stepped into the hallway. She knelt beside him. How are you holding up, sweetheart? He shrugged, eyes downcast. It's weird. The foster place is okay, but I miss you. I miss before Dad got so angry. Helen felt a lump in her throat. I know. Things will get better, I promise. Ethan's lip quivered. Why did Dad hate me so much? Tears sprang to Helen's eyes. He doesn't hate you, Ethan. He's just lost, confused. But he hurt you, and that's never okay. The bailiff called them back in. Soon, everyone was seated again. Judge Nelson cleared her throat. Based on the evidence and the statements provided, I am granting Ms. Helen Baker temporary guardianship of Ethan on the condition that Ms. Baker remains cooperative with Child Services. We will review this arrangement in 3 months. Relief and joy flooded Helen's heart. She turned to see Ethan's face light up with cautious happiness. Livia, standing off to one side, gave a tearful nod of acceptance. The judge continued, as for Mr. Jonas Baker, he will remain in custody awaiting trial. Ms. Livia Baker is free to request visitation with Ethan under supervision, pending further evaluation. After the gavel struck, Helen rushed to Ethan's side, hugging him gently. She wondered if he'd ever feel truly safe again. They gathered in the hallway, and Ms. Barrington handed Helen a packet of paperwork. This covers the next steps. Ethan can return with you today, but you must ensure he attends therapy. We'll schedule check-ins. Ethan's small hand slipped into Helen's. I want to go home, he whispered. She smiled through tears. Then home is where we're going. Before leaving, Livia approached them. I'm so glad you're taking him, she said softly. I just need to figure out my own life. Hopefully I can be worthy of him someday. Helen placed a hand on her daughter-in-law's shoulder. He loves you. When you're ready, we'll figure out how to make that happen safely. Outside the courthouse, a crisp breeze greeted them. Helen led Ethan to her car, which she'd borrowed from a friend. On the drive back to her small town, Ethan stared out the window, taking in the changing scenery. City streets gave way to rolling fields and patches of autumn leaves. Helen tried to lighten the mood by telling him about the rose bushes in her garden. He nodded politely, though his mind seemed far away. They arrived in the late afternoon. Helen's modest home looked cozy in the golden sunlight. Ethan stepped out of the car, hesitating. Grandma, is it really okay for me to be here? Helen guided him toward the front door. This is your home now for as long as you need. Inside, the familiar sense of lavender sachets and freshly baked bread enveloped them. Helen had prepared a small bedroom for Ethan, her old sewing room, now cleared of clutter, with new bedding and a small desk. He walked around it slowly, running a hand over the quilt she'd laid out, embroidered with bright patches. She noticed the uncertainty in his eyes. I know this is all new, but I want you to feel comfortable. I'll never lock you in. You can come and go as you please. Ethan turned, tears forming. He slipped into her arms, hugging her tight. Thank you, Grandma. Helen blinked back tears of her own. We'll make this work, Ethan, I promise. We'll see a counselor. We'll talk about everything when you're ready. But as dusk settled, the weight of all that had happened still pressed heavily on them both. That night, Helen heard Ethan stirring in his sleep, whimpering from a nightmare. She rushed to his side, gently waking him, rubbing his back until he calmed down. "I dreamed Dad was in my room, shouting," he murmured, breath ragged. Helen soothed him, humming a lullaby she used to sing when he was a toddler. It was a small, tender moment, yet the fear in his eyes showed how deeply the abuse had scarred him. Helen realized that though Ethan was physically safe now, the emotional scars were far from healed. She brushed the hair from his forehead, remembering how, as a baby, he would giggle whenever she kissed the top of his head. "You're safe," she whispered. "I won't let anyone hurt you again." Outside, a soft wind rustled the trees. The night was silent, but it was a different kind of silence, a gentler hush that cradled the possibility of healing. Deep down, Helen sensed that despite today's victory, the hardest part might just be beginning. Recovery was a journey, not a single event, and she would need every ounce of patience, love, and courage to guide Ethan toward a life where he could trust, laugh, and dream again. 3 weeks passed in a cautious but hopeful routine. Each morning, Helen rose early to fix Ethan breakfast, oatmeal or scrambled eggs, and drive him to the local elementary school. Despite his lingering anxiety, he slowly adapted to a new normal. The school counselor, Mrs. Reed, arranged weekly sessions to help Ethan cope with the trauma he'd endured. Helen was meticulous in keeping child services informed, emailing Ms. Barrington every Friday with updates. The arthritis in her knees flared up sometimes, but she never let it slow her down. She took pride in welcoming Ethan home each day with a simple snack and a warm smile, offering a sense of stability he desperately needed. One crisp afternoon, as they returned from school, Helen was greeted by an unfamiliar car parked near her curb. She tensed until she saw a young man step out with a friendly wave. "Mrs. Baker, I'm from the local family clinic. I heard you were looking for additional therapy options for Ethan." Relief washed over her. "Yes, come on in," she replied, though Ethan shrank back slightly, eyeing the newcomer warily. Inside, the visitor introduced himself as Dr. Larson, a child psychologist. They discussed a potential plan for trauma-focused therapy. Ethan listened quietly, his gaze drifting between Helen and Dr. Larson. After the psychologist left, Ethan frowned. "Do I really have to talk to more strangers?" Helen knelt beside him. "Only if you feel comfortable, but I think it might help. You've been so brave. Sometimes talking to a professional can make things hurt less." He sighed, but didn't protest further. Over dinner that night, baked chicken and peas, Ethan finally opened up a bit about his nightmares. "They come almost every night," he admitted. "I see Dad yelling at me, telling me it's my fault everything went wrong." Helen reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "It's not your fault, sweetheart. Your dad's anger is about him, not you." It pained her to see how deeply Jonas's abuse had impacted Ethan's self-esteem. Still, there were small victories. The boy had begun to laugh at cartoons again, occasionally even asking if he could help her in the garden. A week later, Livia paid a supervised visit. She arrived looking healthier, a sign she was trying to distance herself from Jonas's destructive influence. Ethan was cautious around her at first, but eventually they shared a timid hug. "I'm so sorry," Livia whispered, tears in her eyes. "I never wanted you to be hurt. I was scared." Ethan studied her face. After a long pause, he nodded. "I know." Helen gave them space to talk, stepping into the kitchen. She overheard bits of the conversation, Livia promising to find stable work, to file for legal separation if Jonas remained in denial. Ethan didn't say much, but at least he didn't push her away entirely. That evening, after Livia left, Ethan asked quietly, "Do you think Mom will be okay?" Helen sat with him on the living room sofa, the TV muted. "I believe she's on a new path, trying to do what's right. Sometimes people need time to find courage. She loves you in her own way." He nodded, absorbing her words. "I hope she can be happy." In the days that followed, Helen began to see subtle changes in Ethan. He grew more at ease walking around the house, never worrying about locked doors. He even ventured outside to ride a bike around the neighborhood. Watching him pedal under the soft sunlight, Helen felt a swell of emotion. This was what childhood should be: freedom, exploration, and a sense of security. However, the specter of Jonas's trial loomed, and rumors spread that he was considering a plea deal. Helen heard from Ms. Barrington that Jonas's lawyer hoped to reduce the charges, possibly arguing for some shared custody down the road. The thought made Helen's blood run cold, but she tried not to let Ethan see her fear. One afternoon, Helen received a phone call from the county prosecutor's office. They asked if she'd be willing to testify to Jonas's history of aggression at the upcoming hearing. Her stomach clenched at the idea of facing her son in court again. Yet she agreed without hesitation, determined to protect Ethan from ever returning to that house of locked rooms and bruises. A few nights before the trial, Ethan struggled to sleep. He paced around his room, eventually finding Helen in the living room, reading a worn paperback novel. His eyes glistened with tears. "I'm scared, Grandma," he admitted, voice shaking. "What if the judge says I have to go back to Dad?" Helen set the book aside and opened her arms, letting Ethan crawl onto the couch beside her. She held him close. "Let's breathe together," she said, demonstrating slow, deep breaths. After a few moments, he relaxed slightly against her shoulder. "I know it's scary," she murmured, "but there's so much evidence showing it's not safe for you to be with Dad. The court will see that, and if they don't, we'll fight until they do." He closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I don't want to hate him, but I feel so angry." Helen stroked his hair. "That's okay. Anger is a normal feeling after what he did. You have every right to feel it. One day you might forgive him, or maybe you won't. That's your choice, but none of this is your fault." They sat quietly for a while, the only sounds being the ticking clock and the faint hum of the heater. Eventually, Ethan's breathing steadied as he drifted off in her arms. Helen looked at his sleeping face, wishing she could erase every painful memory from his mind. She vowed to stand by him no matter what challenges lay ahead. Somewhere outside, an owl hooted into the darkness. The path toward reparation and healing was long and full of twists, but at least they were on it together. Helen carefully maneuvered Ethan into his bed, tucking him under the quilt. In that dim room, she whispered, "I love you." And he mumbled back drowsily, "Love you too, Grandma." She left the room, heart heavy yet hopeful. Tomorrow they would face whatever came. Tomorrow they would take another step on this winding path toward a life free from fear, a path of restarting, of rebuilding something that once was shattered. The day of Jonas's trial arrived under a clear blue sky. Helen felt tension crackling in the air as she and Ethan stepped into the courthouse. This time, she held his hand firmly, neither of them willing to let go. Family members, social workers, and a few reporters lingered around, anticipating a dramatic hearing. They entered the courtroom to find Jonas seated beside his lawyer. He looked thinner, his gaze distant. When he saw Ethan, a flicker of regret, or perhaps sadness, crossed his face, but he quickly looked away. Helen wondered if he was capable of remorse or simply felt cornered by the law. Judge Nelson took the bench, calm but firm. The prosecutor presented the case, outlining Jonas's neglect, emotional abuse, and the physical marks on Ethan's body. Each piece of evidence felt like a nail in the coffin of Jonas's defense. Helen swallowed, recalling the heartbreak she felt at each discovery. At times, she caught Ethan glancing at his father with a mix of anxiety and longing. When it was her turn to testify, Helen described the locked room, Ethan's bruises, and Jonas's threats. The words came out steadier than she expected, fueled by righteous indignation. She also emphasized how well Ethan was doing under her temporary guardianship, how he was starting to heal. Jonas's lawyer then had a chance to cross-examine her. He tried to paint her as an overbearing grandmother, prone to exaggeration. Helen kept her composure, refuting each insinuation calmly, unwavering in her resolve. Finally, Jonas asked the judge if he could speak on his own behalf. His lawyer looked uneasy, but Jonas insisted. Rising, he cleared his throat. "I never meant to hurt my son," he said, voice tremulous. "I was under a lot of stress. My business was failing, and Ethan, he was so quiet I feared he was becoming unstable. I thought locking him up would protect him." A hush fell over the courtroom. Ethan clutched Helen's hand more tightly. Jonas turned to his son, tears brimming. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I got lost in trying to control everything. I see now how wrong I was." Helen's chest tightened. Was this genuine remorse or a desperate attempt for leniency? Judge Nelson listened intently, then asked, "Mr. Baker, do you understand the gravity of your actions?" Jonas looked down at his cuffed hands. "I do, Your Honor. My wife, Livia, was right. I let my fear turn into anger. I hurt the one person I should have protected above all." The judge inhaled, regarding him for a long moment. Then she spoke. "Given the evidence, Mr. Baker, you are found guilty of child endangerment. However, I also see a glimmer of genuine remorse. The court will require you to undergo mandatory counseling and parenting classes as part of your sentence. Further, any potential future visitation with Ethan will be strictly supervised, and only if the child agrees. Ethan will remain in the care of Ms. Helen Baker, with Ms. Livia Baker's visitation rights, pending ongoing assessment." With the final bang of the gavel, a wave of relief flooded Helen. Beside her, Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, tears rolling down his cheeks. The trial was over. Jonas would face consequences and therapy. Ethan would stay safe. Afterward, in the courthouse corridor, a small crowd gathered. Jonas was led away by officers, and for a fleeting moment, he locked eyes with Ethan. He mouthed something, maybe "I'm sorry" or "I love you," but Ethan couldn't tell which. A swirl of emotions crossed the boy's face. Sadness, relief, confusion. Then Jonas disappeared around the corner. Livia stood nearby, uncertain how to approach them, but Ethan, taking a shaky breath, stepped forward. She opened her arms, and he allowed her a gentle hug. "I'm glad you're safe," she murmured, voice cracking. "I promise to work hard so I can be a better mom." Helen watched this with a lump in her throat, recalling how close they'd come to losing Ethan forever. Ms. Barrington came up, offering a document that formally named Helen as Ethan's legal guardian until further review. Helen signed it, hands trembling with gratitude. That evening, they returned to Helen's home. She prepared Ethan's favorite grilled cheese sandwiches, and they ate quietly, both exhausted from the emotional day. After dinner, Ethan retreated to his room for a while. When Helen went to check on him, she found him at the small desk, scribbling something on a piece of paper. Curious, she asked softly, "Working on homework?" He shook his head. "I'm writing a letter to Dad. The counselor said it might help if I wrote down how I feel, even if I never give it to him." Helen approached, her heart aching and proud all at once. The page was filled with words, apologies, anger, sadness, and a longing for a father who had failed him. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "That takes courage." Ethan's eyes flickered with tears. "I don't know if he'll ever read it, but I needed to say these things. Sometimes I miss him and hate him at the same time." Helen knelt beside him, stroking his hair. "It's okay to feel that way. Healing can be messy. Just remember you have people who love you, who want to see you happy." He set down the pen, looking at her. "Grandma, thank you for saving me." She swallowed a sob, pulling him into a tender hug. "You saved yourself too. You were brave enough to keep believing there was a way out, A few days later, the local school organized a small event to honor grandparents who stepped in to care for children in difficult circumstances. Standing on the simple stage, Ethan held a small card in his hands. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped forward, voice shaking. "My grandma gave me a home when I had nowhere else. She saw me when I felt invisible. I love you, Grandma." Helen's eyes brimmed with tears as applause filled the room. Her grandson's voice, once timid and trapped behind locked doors, now resonated freely for all to hear. After the event, they walked home under the golden sunset, the leaves crunching beneath their feet. Ethan told her about a new friend he'd made at school, about how he wanted to learn guitar someday. His face glowed with a hope that had been missing for so long. That night, as Helen tucked him into bed, she noticed the unwritten letter on his desk. He had written, "Dear Dad," at the top, but left the rest blank. Maybe one day he'd finish it, or maybe not. The important part was that he had found a voice, a freedom to express himself. She kissed his forehead and whispered goodnight, shutting off the light. In her own bedroom, Helen settled under the blankets, reflecting on the journey they had taken together, a journey fraught with secrets, fear, and unimaginable pain. Yet, in the end, they discovered a path to healing, forged by love and an unwavering determination to protect a child's innocence. As she drifted off to sleep, the moonlight cast gentle shadows across the room. She held on to the quiet knowledge that families could break and bend, but not always beyond repair. Sometimes, with enough courage, they could find a way to mend piece by broken piece. And in those rare moments of grace, a simple reflection, a bruise in a photograph, could be the start of a new and brighter chapter for them all. Sometimes, it only takes one person to see what everyone else chooses to ignore. Helen's courage, Ethan's resilience, and even Jonas's eventual redemption remind us that love isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing to protect, to listen, and to forgive, even when it hurts. This story showed us that silence can scream louder than words, and that healing begins the moment we decide to truly see one another. What about you? Have you ever ignored something that later turned out to be important? What would you do if someone you loved was silently crying for help? And most importantly, what did this story make you feel? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one of them. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and give this video a like if it touched your heart. Let us know in the comments what country or city you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And now, click the card on the screen to watch our next emotional story. You won't regret it. Thank you so much for watching.